Alors, bonjour tout le monde, bon matin. C'est avec beaucoup de plaisir et une grande fierté que je vous présente notre prochaine invitée. Pour chacune d'entre nous, il y a une ou des personnes qui ont joué un rôle déterminant dans notre engagement comme militante. Je dois vous avouer, depuis mon plus jeune âge, depuis mon adolescence, Madame Davis est un modèle d'engagement pour moi. Un modèle qui refusait l'injustice et qui rappelait que nous possédons comme citoyennes, comme femmes, comme mères, comme travailleuses, comme professionnelles, que nous étions une seule personne à la fois et ce que nous avions, c'est le pouvoir de changer les choses. Madame Davis est née à une époque et dans un milieu où la valeur des gens était associée à la couleur de leur peau et à la discrimination raciale érigée en système social. J'ai eu la chance de l'entendre il y a un an à Montréal lors d'une conférence qu'elle a prononcée. Je suis ressortie énergisée, mobilisée et convaincue que plus que jamais, la mobilisation est nécessaire pour sortir du cadre, changer les choses. Madame Davis possède un parcours de vie impressionnant. C'est corps et âme qu'elle s'est engagée dans la lutte pour plus de justice sociale. Cet engagement lui a même fait vivre l'emprisonnement. Pour les plus jeunes, en 1970, elle a été accusée de meurtre et condamnée à la peine de mort suite à un procès sans fondement. C'est une campagne internationale de solidarité qui s'appelait Free Angela Davis, menée pendant 16 mois de son incarcération qu'elle a pu être libérée. Sans ce mouvement international, qui sait combien d'années elle serait restée incarcérée ou encore exécutée. Philosophe et féministe, elle assume des fonctions d'enseignante tant au niveau universitaire que dans l'espace public, où elle fait valoir l'importance de la lutte populaire pour l'égalité économique, raciale et des sexes. Elle est l'auteure de 9 livres et professeure émérite d'histoire de la prise de conscience et en études féministes à l'Université de Californie à Santa Cruz. Je pourrais continuer très longtemps à vanter les mérites de cette femme extraordinaire qui a changé les choses, mais je préfère vous laisser le privilège de l'écouter. Alors, je vous présente Madame Angela Davis.
Merci beaucoup et bonjour. Je veux dire merci beaucoup pour l'invitation de participer dans le 10e Congrès de la Fédération interprofessionnelle de la santé Québec. Et quelques mots de plus en français. J'ai beaucoup d'admiration pour la tradition radicale ici en Québec et surtout pour le syndicalisme, mouvement social et féministe. Vous comprenez? Et surtout la lutte contre la privatisation de la santé. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in your convention. And let me say to your President, Régine Laurent, that it is a great honor to speak to you, especially since you are dedicated to an approach to health that refuses to subordinate health to the demands of profit. The members of your federation, who are a majority women, do important work in preserving and restoring health to vast numbers of people. You understand that everyone deserves to be healthy, regardless of race, regardless of nationality, regardless of economic status. And let me say that your neighbor to the south can certainly learn from your efforts to create small community clinics and homes for seniors, where seniors themselves retain the autonomy to make decisions about their lives. While The treatment of disease is important. You know not to equate health with the diagnosis and treatment of individual illnesses after they occur. Progressive public health movements call upon us to prevent physical, mental, and spiritual disorders of individuals and communities alike. I want to talk a little this morning about imprisonment, incarceration, racialized incarceration, whether it affects Black or Latino people or Aboriginal or Muslims. It is a major health issue. And of course, there's also the question of prevention. And in this sense, issues like food justice are certainly a health issue. There is a direct correlation between the proliferation of fast food restaurants and diseases like diabetes and heart disease. Now, let me return to the question of incarceration. Mass incarceration is a public health hazard. And in many ways, the increased use of imprisonment as the primary path toward collective security reflects the same kind of structural problem as the increased use of pharmaceuticals and surgical and other medical interventions as the primary path toward health. I think we all know that health is only possible through prevention and wellness. And similarly, public security and a healthy community will only be possible through addressing and solving the myriad problems that lead so many people along a trajectory that ends in juvenile detention, adult prisons, and in the US, of course, death row. And I mentioned mass incarceration because unfortunately it appears that, that Canada is following in the footsteps of its neighbor to the south. And in the US, mass incarceration is a public health hazard that has reached crisis proportions. For a very long time, public health practitioners, advocates, and activists have been debating the impact of racism on the health of our communities, the collective health of our society, and the health of individual members. And this morning, I want to try to contribute to this discussion by pointing to the most obvious and most dramatic evidence of the persistence of racism in the 21st century, and that is mass incarceration. We know that health is not simply the lack of disease. It is not simply about staving off death. It is about challenging and hopefully eradicating the causes of disease, no matter how deeply entrenched they are in the social and economic structures that have shaped our lives. If we wonder why so many people of color are afflicted with preventable diseases like type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, we can make a case that it is in part related to capitalist food production and distribution. If all the McDonald's in the world suddenly disappeared, Can you imagine that? And were replaced with healthy, affordable eating establishments that do not depend on the torture of animals and the destruction of biodiversity and the Monsanto monopoly, but rather organic, healthy, non-GMO food, we would be confronted with a very different picture with respect to health and wellness. The current mode of capitalist food production both takes advantage of structural racism and it contributes to the deeper entrenchment of racism. And likewise, the conjunction of political, economic, media, correctional structures that we have come to call over the last 15 years or so the prison industrial complex benefits from and contributes to the perpetuation of racism. You know, why is it that even in the US, even though African Americans constitute something like 13% of the population, they're almost half of the imprisoned population. Native Americans are also disproportionately represented in the prison population. Here in this country, of course, First Nations people are vastly disproportionate in the incarcerated population. And of course, there are those who might argue that, well, Black people and Latinos and First Nations people here are simply more inclined to commit criminal acts. But of course, they forget the part played by surveillance. And if one looks at the communities that are most saturated with law enforcement surveillance, it makes sense that those communities produce disproportionately more people who end up moving into the prison system. They forget that people of color have been historically constituted as the easiest targets of law enforcement since the aftermath of colonization, since slavery. And sometimes we forget that institutions have much longer memories than individuals. If we take the question of police violence, and many of you followed the case of Trayvon Martin, yes. And the trial of George Zimmerman. And many people were very angry when George Zimmerman was not convicted and sent to prison. But I would ask whether the conviction and imprisonment of one individual effectively addresses this historical issue of racist violence, which is, as I said before, a very important health issue in our communities. Racist violence cannot be eliminated by simply addressing individual cases, and certainly not by simply arresting one individual perpetrator. As a matter of fact, what happens is that it creates the illusion that we are actually addressing the problem when in actuality the problem is being reproduced. So how do we address the historical dimensions and the institutional dimensions of racism that will put us on the path to a non-racist society? And I think this is a question that public health activists should grapple with. I mean, we can say that mass incarceration, and this is a term that was popularized by Michelle Alexander in her book, the new Jim Crow. Mass incarceration is imprisonment that is fueled by racism. And moreover, mass incarceration has been produced by the workings of a global prison industrial complex that is linked to the rise of the globalization of capital, which leads, of course, to an increased emphasis on profit and not people's needs. And of course, for a very long time, we have said people before profit. People before profit. That is a slogan that unfortunately has not become obsolete. It is profitable for those who control the flows of capital to be able to ignore human need, to be able to ignore the need for education, for housing, for recreation, and of course for health care. Since the 1980s, that is, since the Reagan-Bush years, and some of you may be too young to remember the Reagan-Bush years, but certainly they exist in your historical memory. During that period, the whole infrastructure of social services in the U.S., public health care, people have forgotten now what it means to have public health care, public education. Even the universities that used to be free now have tuitions that are so high that the vast majority of people cannot even imagine now attending a university. And I know here in Quebec last year with the student demonstrations, people in the U.S., students dedicated to public education, looked to the struggles that were unfolding here in Quebec. Public housing. This infrastructure has so deteriorated that we can now hardly imagine health, education, housing, except within the framework of corporate profit. What does not generate profit becomes irrelevant to the economy. Instead of responding to people's needs for health, for wellness, for education, for housing, for community, for a collective vision of the future, simply incarcerate them and then pretend the problem has evaporated because you have gotten rid of the people who have the problem. Take advantage of the fact that there are large populations of people in which generations have suffered under the impact of racism and economic injustice. They are products, we say in the U.S., of the failure to fully abolish slavery. They are products of the genocidal colonization of Native people, indigenous people. Pretend that contemporary social problems, complicated by the failure to address them historically, can be rendered invisible simply by putting people in prison. And moreover, make that process of incarceration profitable. As health and education move further from the reach of poor people, especially poor people of color, as health, as education become increasingly privatized and corporatized, as does incarceration, the illusory solution to the problem of the commodification of the means to fulfill human need. So all of this becomes privatized and corporatized. In the United States, we contribute 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's imprisoned population. As a matter of fact, you might call the U.S. a prison nation. And there is a recently published book authored by Beth Ritchie, whose title is Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and America's Prison Nation. Women are still the fastest growing sector of the imprisoned population. And then, of course, when one considers the fact that violence against women is the most epidemic form of violence in the world, which cannot be dealt with simply by arresting and imprisoning the perpetrators. And so the extent to which women suffer violence becomes complicated. Domestic violence, partner violence, intimate violence becomes complicated by the institutional violence that is inflicted upon them when they are incarcerated. And of course, I think it is of special interest to health activists to acknowledge the degree to which the so-called war on drugs is responsible, more than any other factor, for soaring rates of incarceration all over the world. In the US, 1 out of every 100 people is in jail or prison. 1 out of every 100 adults. But if one looks at the extent to which people are under the direct control of correctional agencies, it is the case that 1 out of 37 people is under the direct control of a correctional agency, which includes, of course, probation or house arrest or parole. And this phenomenal rate of incarceration is driven first and foremost by the war on drugs. And it's very interesting. I don't have time to go into this. This is particularly interesting, I think, to health activists, that the so-called war on drugs, which develops during that same era, the Reagan-Bush years, the 1980s, happens at the same time as the rise of the pharmaceutical industry. And so you have licit drugs that are being represented as the answer to everyone's issues. And at the same time, you have the increasing incarceration of poor people, people of color, because of the penetration of illicit drugs in our communities. The point I'm making is that we cannot engage in a process of simplification that prevents us from perceiving the relations and connections and intersections of events and processes that we oftentimes see as unrelated. And so if we are examining incarceration, justice, and health, we cannot confine our field of vision to our immediate communities, whether we're referring to our cities, our states, our nations. It's especially important to move beyond the boundaries of the nation. And I know that both in the US and in Canada, immigration has emerged as a main issue, particularly since the period of the 1980s, which witnessed the emergence of global capitalism and the disestablishment of welfare states all over the world and structural adjustment in the third world. Vast numbers of people are held in immigrant detention facilities every year. As a matter of fact, immigrant detention is the most profitable sector of the prison industrial complex. And if you look at the US, you see that private prison companies are responsible for writing the model legislation, the most repressive legislation with respect to immigration. And in the US now, we have an undocumented movement, young people who have come out as undocumented in order to give leadership to what I think is perhaps the major civil rights movement of our era. They demand education rights, housing rights, the right to be free of intimate violence, and, of course, the overall right to be healthy. And so I think we can say that there can be no significant movement for public health that does not acknowledge the central role played by immigrants. And as the immigrant movement demands health and education for all, not repression, not deportation, they give expression to the aspirations of the majority of people. Now, I want to, as I move towards my conclusion, I want to talk about the connection between such issues as the deepening and expanding Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, which has helped to drive the so-called war on terrorism as anti-communism functioned to create moral panics about socialism. And this is in part responsible for our failure to understand, for example, the occupation of Palestine and the major conjunctions of human rights and health rights in the occupied territory. And of course, whenever this conflict, this issue is raised, it is under the guise of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which prevents people from recognizing that since 1948, Israel has confiscated the land, the natural resources, and the future of the Palestinians. The great Israeli historian Ilan Papp calls the assault on Palestine the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, because half of the indigenous people living in Palestine have been driven out, half of their villages and towns destroyed. And he writes, "It is indeed hard to understand why a crime that was perpetrated in modern times and at a juncture in history that called for foreign reporters and UN observers to be present should be so totally ignored. And yet," he writes, "there is no denying that the ethnic cleansing of 1948 has been eradicated almost totally from the collective global memory and erased from the world's consciousness." And so when I think about the extent to which the struggle for Palestinian sovereignty has been isolated within the world, I try to imagine what it might have been like had there never been any international support for the struggles of black people in the United States. I certainly recognize that had there been no international solidarity movement around my case, including the participation of vast numbers of people here in Canada, I would more than likely still be in one of the women's prisons in the state of California today. And I'm asking you also to remember the anti-apartheid movement, how anti-apartheid activism, and especially the involvement of health activists all over the world, brought much needed support to the ANC and eventually helped to bring down apartheid. And I wonder why we can't see that Israeli apartheid is just as bad. And I raise the issue of Palestine in the context of a discussion of mass incarceration, health, and justice, because I do not believe that there can be enduring prospects for democracy in the world unless we are willing to acknowledge and support those who are working toward a free Palestine. And moreover, as many people have put it, Palestine is the largest open-air prison in the world. If we look at the deployment of carceral technologies by Israel, not only for the imprisonment of a population that is largely Palestinian, but if we examine how these technologies have aided Israel in incarcerating and surveilling a putatively free population. And I should point out that we often do not hear about the struggles inside Israel, about the part that young Israeli Jews are playing in revealing this gross transgression. And I wonder why we cannot see that that the repression in the occupied territories requires the kind of solidarity that eventually assisted in the overturning of apartheid. I remember when Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist. And as a matter of fact, it is very interesting that Nelson Mandela was not taken off of the U.S. terrorist list until 2008. And so this means when Nelson Mandela was president of the new South Africa, each time he visited the U.S., there had to be an exception made because he was still on the terrorist list. How quickly we forget. There are many issues I would like to address. But let me bring this part of my presentation to a conclusion by saying that I hope that you have had a very exciting and productive conference. I know that you have been meeting for the last 5 days. And I hope that this conference has recharged you to work for health and justice. And let me conclude by asking us all to remember that justice is not partial. Justice is always indivisible. As Dr. Martin Luther King said, justice is indivisible, and injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. And injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so we need peace, equality, justice, and health, and maybe even eventually socialism for us all. Thank you very much.
Merci. Alors, sur la présentation, nous allons ouvrir un comité plénier large, questions, commentaires, 45 minutes. Micro 2.
Bonjour, Edna Wang, C3S Gatineau. Mon micro vient de lâcher. Je vais essayer de tenir le micro et tenir la feuille.
Un instant, s'il vous plaît.
Ah, merci.
D'accord, allez-y.
D'accord. Thank you, Mrs. Davis. We always tend to see the grass greener in our neighbor's yard. Well, you slapped me pretty hard. My neighbor's grass is not green. In fact, it's the desert. I was a nurse in a detention center for 3 years, and I can tell you that the respect I had from the prisoners, not from the guards, not from my colleagues. And I want to ask you, did the fact that you have now a black president in Mr. Obama help change the vision of the people against colored person? And the other thing, I know Barack Obama is in the money business. He's part of the rich, so maybe not that much of a change. And could it be possible to have the transcript of your conference? Because you said so much thing, and it would be nice just to read it part by part and take a deep conscience, taking conscience of it. And again, thanks for that eye-opening speech.
Merci. Micro 3.
Michel Boisclair, exécutif FIQ. Merci. Merci beaucoup pour votre indignation. Il n'y a pas d'âge, selon moi, pour poursuivre d'être indigné contre toute forme d'injustice, et c'est ce que je retiens le plus de votre conférence ce matin, comme féministe, comme citoyenne, et surtout comme une militante engagée. Ça m'encourage. Je pense que si je peux avoir aussi l'air jeune que vous dans mes 10, 15, 20 prochaines années, avec la fougue que vous avez, on pourra changer le monde. La question que j'ai à vous poser, c'est quel a été le moment de votre vie, parce que j'ai lu sur votre biographie, mais le moment le plus marquant de votre vie qui vous a amené à poursuivre votre lutte, parce que la pomme ne tombe jamais loin du pommier, vos parents étaient des militants, vos parents étaient engagés. Et qu'est-ce qui fait que vous avez toujours cette force-là? Moi, j'avais signé la pétition à l'époque quand vous étiez incarcéré. Et ce que j'en retiens, c'est que des fois, on dit une pétition, ça ne change pas le monde. Moi, j'ai commencé à comprendre que quand on faisait des pressions politiques sur les gouvernements et qu'on savait les secrets qu'ils voulaient garder à l'intérieur, on était en mesure de changer le monde pour des personnes qui peuvent avoir une contribution extraordinaire. Merci, c'est mon plus beau cadeau de fin de congrès. Merci.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. And I'll begin with the first question. And the part of the first question that specifically points to the election of Barack Obama and ask whether there have been any fundamental changes as a result. Well, I would answer that question in a couple of ways. First of all, I would say that it is important to remember the moment when Obama was elected. There was almost more celebration in Canada than in the US. because I actually happened to travel here in the days afterwards, and I was impressed by the euphoria and the excitement everywhere. And of course, it is important to point out that Obama was elected because of the emergence of a movement. There were those who said that a black man can never be elected to the presidency of the United States. And then there were especially young people who refused to believe that and who kept saying, yes, he can be elected. And so the energy of that movement was, in my opinion, most important, and we should never forget that movement. I think what happened was that many people forgot that we were actually trying to elect a president of the racist, imperialist, capitalist United States of America. And that, as a matter of fact, if there were to be a progressive future, that future would have to be forged by a continuing mass movement. And many of us went home. We went to the ballot box, we elected him, and then we said, okay, now Obama, you can carry the ball from now on. And one of the things I found impressive about Obama was that he said, I cannot do this alone. But I don't think people listened to him. But of course, here we are 6 years later, and a black president of the United States of America is old hat. And so many of the promises that he made have not been kept. Guantanamo is still open. How is it possible that Guantanamo can still, function as one of the most repressive prisons in the world? So I would say, yes, I think it is important that we manage to elect a person like Barack Obama, a person named Barack Obama, to the office of the presidency of the U.S., but that is not the end of the struggle for justice and equality. And so hopefully we will recognize that and continue. Now the second question, what was the second question?
The second question is, what is the moment you're starting to be?
Oh, that's right. Well, and the third question was why I was.
The third question.
Why I'm still so
commented.
committed. Yeah. Okay. The second and the third question are related, right? That's why I looked at my notes and I said, that was the second question. When I don't think there was ever a particular moment when I had in French you say prise de conscience, right? Of my dedication to the struggle for justice, because many people have asked me that question, and I've come up with answers over the years, and I said, well, it was when the 4 girls were killed in the church bombing in 1963 in Birmingham. And then I said, no, actually, I was conscious and committed before that. So perhaps it was when I first became an activist at about 11 years old when I joined an interracial discussion group, which was illegal in Birmingham. And as a matter of fact, the church where we held our meetings was burned. Many people think of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church is something extraordinary and exceptional, but these bombings were happening all the time. The Ku Klux Klan simply ruled the city where I lived, Birmingham, Alabama. And then finally I came to the conclusion that it was probably because my mother encouraged all of us to imagine what life would be like if we ended segregation. I used to ask her over and over again, why can't we do this? Why can't we go to the library? The library was for white children. Why can't we go to the amusement park? Only white kids were allowed to go to the amusement park. And so my mother never said, oh, this is just the way things are. She always pointed out that this is not the way things are supposed to be. And she said that to me over and over again. This is not the way things are supposed to be organized. And one day they will be different, and you will contribute to that difference. So I often realize that I developed an attitude that you might call critical thinking, long before I began to study critical theory. I learned how to imagine what the future might be like if we were committed to forging a new future through struggle. And so I like to point out to young activists that you don't have to have this epiphany. And it doesn't have to be anything special. It can be the way you learn how to live your life. And I think that is the kind of commitment that is lasting, that you can carry with you throughout your entire life. And here I am I just had my 70th birthday this year. And I'm very proud that I've spent almost all of those 70 years involved in the struggle for justice, equality, and peace. And I think that also answers the third question.
Merci. Micro 5.
Oui, bonjour. Félicitations pour être ce que vous êtes. J'ai les mêmes constats que vous auprès des Israéliens, les Palestiniens, les sans-papiers en Haïti qui sont en République dominicaine. Mais aux États-Unis, si je me trompe, la population noire est en train de dépasser la population blanche. Et je sais que pour tous les problèmes, c'est la pauvreté qui fait que les gens sont poussés parfois à faire des gestes pour survivre, que des gens n'ont jamais vu la campagne. Je sais qu'à Détroit, par exemple, c'est une ville qui est en train de en tout cas, ce que je voulais dire, c'est qu'il y a des jeunes qui prennent des initiatives, vu qu'il y a des parcs, de faire des jardins, de faire des collectes d'aliments, vous savez, pour pouvoir faire pour survivre. Alors, c'était ça mon point de vue. Merci.
Merci. Micro 6.
Charlotte Darissimon, première vice-présidente à IM et éducation et animation comité. Hi, Ms. Davis. It's a great honor to have you here today. I am really a big fan of you for who you are and what you represent. Now I'm going to switch in French for my question. Aux États-Unis, il y avait la réforme de la santé de 2010 par Obama. Il a réussi à passer le projet de loi. J'aimerais savoir qu'est-ce que vous pensez de Obamacare. Thank you.
Merci. Micro 1.
Lynn Larocque from the McGill University Health Center. Good morning, Madame Davis. My question is regarding the media and the influence that they can have regarding the population, how they treat the minority, I can say. So I think I have my answer, but I would like to hear from you. If they influence more in a negative way than positive, I guess. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the first question that I think makes the point that our commitment should not be narrow, but that we should be aware of and involved in what is happening beyond our communities and beyond our nations. And you mentioned Haiti, and I mean, it's so terrible that right after the earthquake, there appeared to be this interest all over the world about what was unfolding in Haiti. But now you rarely see anything in the media, and of course the ongoing reconstruction continues to take place. And with respect to Haiti, I remember when the earthquake took place, I was very angry about the representations of Haiti as simply the poorest country in the world, and not as the country that can perhaps claim to be the first non-racial democracy in the world. And of course, without the struggles of Toussaint de l'Ouverture and the people of Haiti, the civil rights struggle, the anti-slavery struggle, the civil rights struggle in the U.S. never would have been possible. And you evoke also the problems in our cities, and certainly Detroit, which was one of the industrial centers of this part of the world. And now, as a result of the deindustrialization that accompanies the rise of global capitalism and the efforts of capitalist manufacturers to find labor pools that were less organized and cheaper, Detroit was also the center of trade union activism. And I think that you're absolutely right to evoke these issues and remind us that there's a great deal on our agendas of struggle. The second question about Obamacare. Well, you know, first of all, isn't it incredible that in the United States there is no such thing as universal health care? I mean, why is it that it is so important to place the needs of a profitable industry, and the healthcare industry is a corporate industry that actually becomes the model for the developing privatization of imprisonment? Well, I guess I would say I'm glad that Obama did attempt to create some change, but the change has been so minimal. Well, I guess I have to take a feminist position here. I have to be both for and against. I think it is important that people now who never had access to health care insurance do have some insurance, but it's so minimal. You know, we need like a single payer approach to health care. Everybody should have the right to health care. They should not have the right to purchase health care insurance, which is what Obama care is all about. Now, the final question on media and influence, whether the media influence has been more negative than positive. I don't know whether I can answer that question in a straightforward way. What I will say is that the importance of social media during this period has been able to counteract, some of the what you might call negative influences of the established media. But then on the other hand, I think that even as we have the ability to communicate with one another on a scale that was totally unimaginable 10 or 20 years ago, we also have tended to assume that that ability to communicate can take the place of organizing movements. Social media allows us to mobilize vast numbers of people. We can bring people out, as you know, for a demonstration within a relatively short period of time. But I think that sometimes we assume that demonstrations are movements. And when people come out for a particular cause on one day, but then they go back home and they don't experience themselves emotionally as a part of that movement, we haven't really done our work. My sense has always been that demonstrations, while we're often demonstrating against something or demonstrating for something, they also demonstrate the existence of a movement. And we carry that movement with us in our hearts and in our sense of feeling connected to people in other places and other worlds who believe in justice and freedom. Thank you.
Merci. Micro 2.
Suzanne Gagnon, SPSQ, représentante de la condition féminine. In order that the next government will be probably Republican, are you afraid of the after Obama? That's my first question. In order, if Hillary Clinton will be the next president, will it change something? That's it.
Oh, that's right.
Merci. Micro 5.
Will Menelas, hôpital Santa Gabriela. Merci beaucoup pour votre présence ici aujourd'hui. La question que j'aimerais vous poser, quel lien y a-t-il aujourd'hui entre le racisme et le système carcéral? Monsieur Nelson Mandela est parti, c'est vrai, mais vous êtes encore là pour nous. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Micro 6.
Oui, bonjour. Tanigou Collins, hôpital Santa Cabrini. Merci déjà à l'exécutif d'avoir invité une femme d'exception que vous êtes. Je me demande comment, je ne vous ai jamais connue, là. C'est cette semaine que j'ai entendu parler de vous. Et on dit souvent mieux vaut tard que jamais. Hein? Donc, je suis tellement content de faire votre connaissance. Ce qui m'a permis également d'aller vous lire votre bibliographie. Et j'ai constaté que vous êtes allé en France, vous avez étudié en France pendant les années 60. Et lorsque je regarde les années 60, ce sont des années de lutte d'indépendance en Afrique. Et la France, c'est une grande puissance coloniale. Alors, j'aimerais savoir si, à cette période, quand vous étiez en France, est-ce que vous avez ressenti du racisme plus qu'aux États-Unis ou moins qu'aux États-Unis? J'aimerais ça vous entendre là-dessus. Et également, cette époque de décolonisation, disons de lutte d'indépendance en Afrique, a suivi l'incarcération de beaucoup de leaders africains. Et aujourd'hui, j'ai fait un parallèle avec le CPI, la Cour pénale internationale, où il y a un certain mouvement en Afrique qui disent que le CPI a été créé uniquement pour condamner les leaders, les anciens leaders africains. J'aimerais ça également vous entendre votre opinion là-dessus. Une troisième question, Madame Angela, est-ce que vous pensez que vous êtes une femme chanceuse? Pas chanceuse dans votre vie? Une dernière question. Moi, excusez. Une dernière question. Moi, quand j'ai lu votre bibliographie, j'ai dit, ah, c'est Nelson Mandela made in USA. Qu'est-ce que vous me répondez là-dessus également? Et est-ce qu'il y a une différence? Si je vous demandais une différence qu'il y a entre vous et Nelson Mandela, qu'est-ce que vous me répondrez? Merci.
Sur ce, réponse, s'il vous plaît.
The first question. Then I'll have to figure out how many questions you ask. The first question about the next election in the U.S. Of course, yes, I am concerned. And I don't think that it is a question of whether the candidate is black or a woman. Of course that makes a difference. Of course it makes a difference. But certainly if I had thought that Obama, well, let me put it this way. If it had been Clarence Thomas instead of Obama, I would have said, no, absolutely not. It's not simply about race and gender, it's about politics. And so I would argue that it is not so much about Hillary Clinton as it is about the kinds of movements that are dedicated to pressuring her to do the right thing. And moreover, I don't think it's individual presidents who create political futures. I continue to believe that it is masses of people who come together and express their political aspirations in that way. Now, the second question had to do with the connection between racism and the prison system. Of course, I tried to talk about that a bit in my presentation. I can say that in the US, the prison system that we witness today is very much connected to the institution of slavery. As a matter of fact, it is one of those institutional reminders that slavery was not fully abolished. And it's not simply because of the fact that the majority of people in prison are black people and people of color. And that is, of course, the case. But it is the institutional effect. It is the structural racism. And the prison system is the most dramatic example of the kind of racism that prevails today, for which we have not created a popular vocabulary, because people assume that because racist laws were abolished, because people are not able with impunity to give expression to racist ideas, that racism is abolished. But the fact is that racism is very much entrenched in our institutions, and not only in prisons, but also in the educational institutions and also the healthcare institution. Race really matters with respect to who gets to go to the university and who gets to go to prison. It really matters with respect to who gets the best health care and who doesn't. And now the third set of questions, and I'm not sure whether I will be able to answer every one of your questions, but I'll say that when I spent time in France, I actually went to France for the first time right after my first year in college. And I did have some illusions. I did imagine that that France was a place where racism was not so evident. And as a matter of fact, my trajectory, interestingly enough, had been from the south to the north. When I went to high school in the north, I assumed that I was liberating myself from racism. But of course, in the northern US, I discovered that there were modes of racism that we hadn't yet really learned how to recognize. And then when I went to France, I thought, oh, you know, France is this la liberté, égalité, fraternité. You know, I will experience a world without racism. And the first time I went to France, it was right in the middle of the Algerian War. And as a matter of fact, I was mistaken for an Algerian. So I very quickly learned that racism was, of course, very much alive in France. And of course, you're right, it was an era of struggles for Black liberation, for African liberation, and all of us who were active during that period were very much influenced by these struggles for liberation, you know, all over Africa, in Southern Africa, in what was at that time Portuguese Africa, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola. And do I think I am fortunate? Yes, I think I'm very fortunate. I'm fortunate to have grown up at a time when we recognize that movements can change the world. Do I see myself, what was the question about Mandela? There's no way in the world I could begin to compare myself to Nelson Mandela. But I will say that what I most appreciated about Mandela was the fact that he always pointed out that it was not him alone. Yeah. It was not, he alone was not responsible for, you know, all of the activism that brought down apartheid. He never took credit for anything as an individual. He always pointed out that it was his comrades, his sisters and brothers, people in South Africa, all over the world. And that is, I think, what I most admire about Nelson Mandela. And of course, I have been inspired by him and had the opportunity to meet him, which was the high point of my life, given that I had become involved in the campaign for his freedom in the 1960s, shortly after he was arrested. And so Nelson Mandela remains, for me, a shining star. But let me say that the struggles in South Africa continue. And the issues that you're talking about at this conference issues of privatization, issues of the impact of capitalist profit on human need are the major issues with which people in South Africa are grappling today, as is the issue of the prison industrial complex. South Africa is the site of a number of private prisons. Unfortunately, given the economic situation in South Africa, vast numbers of people are being arrested. And so let me say that what I learned from Nelson Mandela was that the struggle is never over. The struggle always continues. A luta continua. La lutte continue.
Merci. Micro 1.
Ms. Davis, you have done the impossible this evening, or this morning. As I listened to your speech, the impact of that speech and all the years that I have studied you created a sort of a volcanic force that propelled me to this mic. And I want to say one thing, and I have one question. I should say I'm from C2S Cavendish. My name is Christiana Daniel. You have fueled in me a determination to continue in the struggle against injustice. And my question to you is, are you involved in any movement to deal with the problem of incarceration in the States at this time?
Merci. Micro 2.
Joanne Tremblay, C3S de Gatineau. Une question qui tourne autour de la Charte des valeurs. Alors, je voudrais savoir si vous avez entendu parler de la Charte des valeurs ici au Québec. Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez? Qu'est-ce qui arriverait si les États-Unis avaient la merveilleuse idée de faire une Charte des valeurs?
Merci. Micro 3.
Alma Gibbs, PSSU, West des Îles. I have one question for you, and I have to say it's a privilege. I have to tell you before. It's a privilege to meet you. I saw you in 1975. You came to speak to the young black in NDG, and you really impacted me. You helped me to turn my life around, I should say. You mentioned before you fought from 11 years old and you're 70 now. The number 15 in my family have been fighting from birth and still fighting. As a woman, as a healthcare professional, and one question I have to ask you. Do you think there is going to be any changes anytime soon for the falsely accused, incarcerated people in the system? Okay, thank you.
The first question asks whether I am involved in movements against mass incarceration in the U.S. Yes, I'm actually involved with a number of organizations. One of them is called Critical Resistance. And actually, we founded Critical Resistance in 1998, which introduced the term prison industrial complex, and which asked us to think about the problem of mass incarceration in connection with other issues, education, health. And so, of course, the slogans are education, not incarceration, health, not incarceration, recreation, not incarceration. So we see this as a movement that calls for the complete restructuring of society. It's about a new society. So we call this movement the 21st century abolitionist movement. There was the anti-slavery abolitionist movement in the 1800s. In the 1900s, there was the abolitionist movement we call the civil rights movement. And that was a period during which people were struggling, black people were struggling for what we call first-class citizenship. And this so-called second-class citizenship reflected the continued existence of aspects of slavery. And so now, 21st century abolition calls for the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment, which also builds on the struggles of the 20th and 19th century abolitionist movement. I'm also involved in an abolitionist organization in Australia that's called Sisters Inside. And it is an organization that provides services for women who are in prison or who have been released from prison, but it also engages in abolitionist activism. Now, the second question, do I believe that a charter of values would be important in the U.S.? Well, you know, let me say that that in many ways, the struggles that you are conducting here in Canada can give leadership to those of us who believe in equality in the U.S. You know, certainly the struggles against the privatization of health care and the issues that you, as a union, are attempting to address. That is an interesting idea, a charter of values in the U.S. It would, of course, have to be an anti-racist charter, right? It would also have to deal with issues of the continued attacks on women. It would also have to be anti-homophobic. It would have to address issues of gender preference. As a matter of fact, we assume that gender is a binary phenomenon, that it's only about male and female, but increasingly we recognize that gender, like so many other things, is socially constructed. And so what happens when people don't fall within the norm? Those of us who are involved in the prison abolitionist movement are addressing this question because we see that trans people are perhaps and particularly trans people of color, suffer the most repression from law enforcement and from the prison itself. The third question having to do with changes for those who are falsely accused. Well, there are many people who are in prison who are falsely accused. But there are also people who have done what they are convicted of having done. So do you say that only the people who are innocent that they are the only people who deserve our support? Consider the fact that the overwhelming majority of people in prison on drug charges in the U.S. are people of color. Why is that? Is it because Black people or Latinos do more drugs than white youth? Studies have indicated that there is no difference in the rate of drug use or even in the rate of drug trafficking from one community, racialized community, to another. But why is it that most of the people you see in prison are people of color? That has to do with surveillance. It has to do with the fact that those are the people who are the easiest targets. And of course, I'm just remembering a story a friend of mine told me about being here in Canada, a black woman, and walking around and being followed in the store because she was black. And then I can tell you a story of someone that I knew, a friend who was white, who used to shoplift all the time. I mean, she was this woman who was always elegantly dressed, and I was shocked when I discovered that she had been stealing. And I said, oh, that's how you are able to get all of these amazing, clothes and purses. But the thing is, no one ever imagined that she could be engaging in that kind of theft. So she did it with impunity. So if you think about the fact that the notion of innocence is not so simple. It's not simply being innocent of a particular act. We have to take into consideration the racism that is involved in the structuring of expectations and the structuring of surveillance and hyper-surveillance. And so that is why we say the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment. And then, of course, people might say, well, what about those who are really guilty? What about those who do horrible things? Those who commit horrible acts of harm, who commit acts of murder, who commit acts of rape? And then the answer would be, of course people have to be rendered accountable for what they do, but we also need to ask, why is it that so many people continue to engage in these behaviors? Why is it, with all of our struggles for women's equality all over the world, violence against women, gender violence, is still the most pandemic form of violence in the world, even though we have begun to arrest many people who are accused of gender violence? I think that it's not about arresting people, because when you arrest them, and simply throw them in prison, that allows you to forget about the problem. It's about trying to figure out how to purge our societies of this violence, and how to understand the extent to which people are oftentimes impelled to commit these acts because they've learned them from the larger society. Why is it that women are such easy targets? By now, it would seem that we would have moved beyond that. But as long as we simply assume that all you have to do is arrest people who do the bad things, then that harm will be reproduced and replicated, and we will always inhabit a society that is saturated with that violence.
Alors, le temps que nous avions initialement alloué au comité plénier large est maintenant écoulé. Il y a 7 personnes derrière les micros. 6 maintenant. Il y a 6 personnes derrière les micros. Alors, je vais demander à la délégation si elle accepte que l'on prolonge le comité plénier pour entendre les 6 personnes derrière les micros. Quels sont celles et ceux qui sont pour? Merci. Les contre? Merci. Les abstentions? Alors, c'est adopté à majorité. Nous allons prendre les 6 personnes en rafale. Alors, au micro 4.
Bonjour, Madame Davis. Mon nom est Jean Paris, retired FIQ consultant. I came here specially because of your presence. Therefore, I claim the right to be at the microphone. I think Regine would have been very disappointed if she didn't see me here anyway, given who I am. First, I want to thank you for your contribution to the Black Power movement, because it's because of people like yourself that I can stand at this microphone today. And I really want you to know that we in Quebec, who have come here as immigrants, who are enjoying the kind of life that we are now enjoying, it's because people like you were bold enough to stand up and fight the battle to live the kind of life that we are now experiencing today. So I want to thank you. I want to make a statement to get your reaction. The presence of Barack Obama in the highest office in the world has opened the eyes of the blind to the extent of racism in the United States of America. In my simplistic view, the Congress and the Republicans in America would rather bring the United States to the ground rather than see a black man succeed in that role. It's like the boy giving orders to the master. I'd like your comment.
Merci. Micro 5.
Jean-Luc, hôpital Santa Gabrini. Merci pour votre présence. Je suis comblé ce matin. Mais ma question, comment se sentent les Noirs américains aujourd'hui aux États-Unis, vu que le président Obama est noir? Merci.
Micro 1.
Suzanne Alling, PSSU, Vice President for the Respiratory Therapists and Perfusionists at the Jewish General Hospital. I would like to thank you for sharing your opinions and experience with us today. In every successful movement, it takes people who are willing to stand
Madame,
up.
je m'excuse de vous interrompre. Pouvez-vous parler plus directement dans le micro, s'il vous plaît? On vous entend mal.
Okay. Thank you for sharing your experiences and opinions with us today. In every successful movement, it takes people who are willing to stand up to fight for justice, no matter what. I would like to thank the organizers of this 10th Congress for inviting such informative and interesting speakers this last week. Je veux dire merci à tous ceux qui ont organisé ce congrès. Merci pour un 10e congrès bilingue. On doit continuer en tout temps à oser, agir et influencer. Merci.
Merci. Micro 2.
Lynn Santiago from Mount Sinai Hospital, SRPSQ. I would just like to thank you for coming here today. And actually, my husband has a question for you. What do you he's not here today. He just texted me this question. He would like to know what you think of Quebec's Charter of Values.
Merci. Micro 3.
Marie-Claude Ouellette, comité exécutif, comité organisateur du congrès. Je voudrais raconter un petit peu à la délégation quand Régine nous a parlé de Mme Davis et que le comité, je vais continuer, et que le comité a commencé à faire les démarches auprès de Mme Davis pour qu'elle soit ici à notre 10e congrès. Je ne compterai pas de niaiserie, Régine. On était très fébrile, le comité organisateur, en attendant votre réponse. Quand on a reçu votre réponse, je vous dis, on était fous de joie. Puis je veux vous remercier parce que je le sais que vous êtes arrivés à 3 heures cette nuit et que vous avez eu une courte nuit de sommeil. Et ça, les délégués, ils ne savent pas que des fois, pour les conférenciers, ce n'est pas des journées faciles. Et je voudrais vous remercier aussi pour votre générosité. Moi, je pars d'ici rempli d'énergie. J'étais très fatiguée ce matin, mais je pense que vous avez rechargé ma batterie. Et je veux aussi rappeler aux délégués qu'on s'est procuré la majorité des livres, la biographie de Mme Davis à travers le Québec. Il n'y en a plus, c'est toute la FIQ qui les a achetés et c'est toute la délégation qui les a achetés parce qu'il n'en reste plus.
Et on a essayé d'en acheter aussi en anglais, mais malheureusement, on n'en a pas trouvé. Alors, ce qu'on a fait, c'est qu'on a fait des copies du couvert de la biographie en anglais et Mme Davis va être disponible tantôt pour les signatures. Fait que je vous remercie de votre générosité et merci d'être avec nous.
Micro 1.
Linda Ross, SPS au Richelieu-Rouville. I'm very intimidated. I want to thank you so much for coming to this Congress. It's an amazing surprise, and I would like also to thank the executive of having the great idea of inviting you here. Now, my question for you is, well, first comment and then question. I believe that the carceral system in the United States is crazy, and using the terms that you use, describing it as a industrial complex, which is, I think it's wise to call it that way. Now, in the 80s, when Ronald Reagan started his war on drugs, and this is a personal opinion, but it was really more a way to repress ethnic minorities in the United States. War on drugs meant going into black neighborhoods and have massive arrests. All the while, if I'm not mistaken, he was smuggling cocaine inside the US to pay for weapons for his counter-revolutionaries in Central America. Now, my question is, the efforts that are being made now in the United States to address the problem of drug abuse, do you think it's still a means of repressing certain ethnic minorities?
Okay, the last 6 questions. The first question, I think you're absolutely right that the Republicans do not want to see Barack Obama succeed. The extent to which right-wing reaction and repression has evolved over the last 6 years or so is quite amazing. There are those who argue that finally a black person has been elected to the presidency. This must mean that the last barriers to racism in the US have fallen. And so people talk about the post-racial society. But as a matter of fact, one might argue that there have been so many more expressions of racism in terms of individual expressions of racism, but also the structural weight of racism. And it may be true that there are those who don't want to see him succeed because he is black. But there are also those who court black people and want to see more black conservatives. And so therefore I think that it's oftentimes important to have a more complicated analysis. It's not simply because he is black. It is because he, at least during the period of his campaign, associated himself with what you might call the black radical tradition in the US. Whether or not that has continued over the last years is another question. And I think with respect to the second question, the election of Obama did create a different sense of collective sense of belongingness among black people. Now, that can be positive, but it can also be negative. It can be positive in the sense that black people have constituted the largest racially marginalized group in the history of the U.S. But we also can't forget that the country was built on the colonization of indigenous people. And we also can't forget that there's so many racialized groups, Latinos, Asian Americans, Muslims. And my fear is that increasing numbers of Black people are being assimilated into the hierarchical structures. And that, as a matter of fact, we use the term diversity. I don't know whether you use the term diversity in Canada. Do you? Well, diversity is a weird concept because it often doesn't contain with it the notion of justice and equality. And I often say that diversity can mean, particularly in the hands of the corporations, it can mean difference that doesn't make a difference. Difference that doesn't make a difference. And so when we see Black people in the leadership of corporations and Black people in the leadership of the Republican Party, we have to say that at this point, politics are more important than race. We cannot simply look at the race of the person and assume that that this person is going to make a major difference in terms of justice and equality. So I think that the question about how Black people feel, I think it's ambiguous. Black people feel proud. Black people many people said, I never thought I would experience the election of a Black president in my lifetime. That has happened, but now we have to go on and say, okay, been there, done that. So we realize that it's not simply about electing a Black person. It is about continuing the struggles for equality, for justice, the campaigns against privatization, etc. The next question, the next comment, which was directed to the executive committee, and I think it was really important that she pointed out that there have been very interesting speakers. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to make the entire conference. I teach at UCLA, and so I was only able to get a flight from San Francisco yesterday, which was scheduled to arrive here in Quebec City last night at around 10, but my flight from San Francisco was 2 hours late. So I missed the connection in Chicago and ended up having to fly to Montreal instead of Quebec and drive in the middle of the night from Montreal. So I arrived here at 3:30 in the morning. And finally, let's see, I think I answered the question about the Charter of Values. I was saying that hopefully it will inspire something similar in the U.S. I'm constantly suggesting that people in the U.S. not simply consider Canada as following in the footsteps of the U.S., but oftentimes you are engaged in far more progressive struggles here, and then we would do well to take leadership from you here in Canada. So thank you very much for your work. the last question has to do with contemporary efforts to address the problem of drugs. And the speaker did a very good job of pointing out the whole history of the war against drugs and the fact that it's always been a war against the communities that are targeted, and drugs have served as a kind of a pretext. And I've always wondered, in my presentation, I was trying to make the connection between the pharmaceutical trafficking of drugs and the trafficking of drugs that happens in the streets. We live in a society where we're constantly told that drugs will solve any problem that you might have. And I don't know about commercials on television here in Canada, but in the US, you can never watch television without a commercial from a pharmaceutical company that asks you to ask your doctor about this drug or that drug. So whatever problems you have, there's a drug that deals with it. And then what about people who don't have doctors, who can't ask their doctors, especially for the psychotropic drugs? And so, perhaps they ask the local person in their community who handles the drugs. It's not that different a situation, although there are some drugs that are deemed illegal and some that are legal. Now, of course, there have been efforts under the Obama administration to finally address some racial disparities in the prosecution of drug use and drug trafficking. The cocaine disparity, which many of you probably know about, that a person who was found in possession of crack cocaine, a person found in possession of powder cocaine. Well, crack cocaine is much more likely to be discovered in the hands of a poor person of color. Powder cocaine, much more likely to be discovered in the hands of affluent people, mostly white. In order to get the same sentence that a person would receive in possession of crack cocaine, the person with powder cocaine would have to have 100 times as much. So this was a disparity that was actually a racial disparity, but it was couched in legal terms. Finally, the Department of Justice is attempting to address some of these issues, but what we need are not only changes in the legal status, but we also need rehabilitation centers that are available and accessible to people. As a person who's done a lot of work in prisons and jails, I've discovered that there are often people who will commit crimes in order to go before a judge so that they can ask to be diverted to a rehabilitation center, because drug rehabilitation centers are not available to people from the street. So they have to go through the justice system and oftentimes into prison in order to be able to get into a drug rehabilitation center. And so this question is really complicated. And also, since this is the last question, I'll say that it speaks to the failure to address issues of health. And health issues, as I said in my presentation, are not simply about the attempt to stave off death or the attempt to treat disease. Health issues have to be considered holistically. And And as someone who has been involved in social justice movements all of my life, virtually all of my life, it took a while before I realized how we must incorporate issues of health into our movements. And that is to say, the question of self-care. How do we engage in self-care as we struggle so that we do not burn out and assume that there is no future? So I would say that that the health movement, and certainly, those of you who are gathered here, are at the vanguard of the public health movement in Canada and in North America. It is quite interesting to me that all over the world, nurses and people like respiratory therapists seem to be the most radical activists. And I want to thank you for your contributions and bring, greetings from nurses' unions in the States, and also 1199, which is one of the most radical unions in the U.S. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for your contributions to the struggle for justice, freedom, and equality.
Vous avez remercié chaleureusement Mme Davis. Avant de la remercier au nom de l'exécutif, ce que je souhaiterais qu'on retienne, c'est, et c'était vraiment son militantisme que l'équipe Congrès, on voulait que vous reteniez, mais aussi comment on doit travailler pour sortir de toutes les prisons dans lesquelles on nous met. La prison de l'information, la prison de la peur, la prison où nos membres sont victimes de violences dans les établissements de santé et qu'elle n'ose pas réagir. Alors, chaque fois qu'on aura de nos membres victimes du premier venu cadre dans le réseau et qu'elle aura peur, pouvez-vous, s'il vous plaît, lui parler de Mme Davis et que la peur, ça ne mène à rien, c'est la prison dans laquelle on nous maintient. Et je reviens encore sur la prison de l'information. Alors, c'était important pour nous à l'équipe Congrès parce que Mme Davis a une façon de lier toutes les sphères de nos vies. Toutes ces sphères-là, il faut aussi qu'on se rappelle de faire les liens et de dépasser la première impression qu'on veut nous inculquer pour aller au-delà de ça et se faire sa propre opinion. Et je pense que ça va nous aider à défendre les services publics. Avant de remercier Mme Davis, je dois vous remercier, vous, délégués, parce que si je n'étais pas votre présidente, je ne serais pas en train de réaliser un rêve ce matin. Dans mes rêves n'est plus fou, jamais je n'ai pensé être assise quelque part et de présenter Mme Davis. Alors, merci à vous tout d'abord. Merci infiniment. Et merci, Mme Davis. On va s'organiser, on va vous répéter, on va se souvenir de ce que vous nous avez dit avec aussi longtemps que ça fera partie de nos débats, qu'il n'y aura pas de justice, qu'on sera dans la défense de nos services publics, qu'on sera appelé à être dans la rue ou dans les médias ou sur les médias sociaux pour ne plus avoir peur de notre opinion et de ne plus avoir peur de faire des propositions qui répondent à nos valeurs comme professionnels et comme syndicats. Alors, au nom du comité exécutif et du comité organisateur Congrès, je vous remets un petit cadeau, souvenir de nous et de votre passage à Québec. Merci infiniment.
Merci beaucoup.